Assalamu alaikum, I should say, as I've been here for so long, it's a very appropriate expression, and it's a lovely expression. First of all, let me say how pleased I am to be here in India. This is the second time in my life. The last time was a long, long time ago, in 1976. I came to India from Lebanon all the way by road, as far as Calcutta, and went back by road. It was a journey of 4 months. It was an incredible experience. This time, I chose the easier route. I came by plane. Okay. Now, I'm very pleased to be here because India is such a fascinating country. But there's a second reason that I'm pleased to be here, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here because of this gentleman sitting in front of me here. Dr. Devi Prasad was my first student at AUB, the American University, in 1975. And he was like a son to us. My wife considered him a son. So he was with us for about 3 years, and we had a wonderful time, wonderful relationship. And I'm very proud to see what he has become today. He's known to many of you, and it's great. After all those years, I met him the other night. We hadn't seen each other for 30-something years, but the bond was there. It was as if I'd seen him all my life. It was absolutely wonderful, and I'm very, very happy. Now, I was very pleased with him too for another reason. Despite the difficulty in Lebanon at the time, there was a war going on. I seem to attract civil wars wherever I go. We actually published his thesis work, MS thesis, in the best journal, Soils Journal, the Soil Science Society of America Journal. And that's something that makes me feel very proud. But in standing here before you today, I am quite sad. My happiness is tempered by the fact that I'm going to be talking about a country, a region that I've been part of for virtually all my professional life, nearly 40 years. That's the Middle East. It's a region of turmoil. It's a lot worse than when I came there in 1975. I'm very sad to think of what has happened in Syria. You all know about the civil war going on, the terrible destruction. And it's hard to not feel for the human beings there, that the people who are displaced, the hundreds of thousands that are killed. Many of the people I actually know. And that's one of the great difficulty of working in the field of agricultural development overseas. These things happen. So it is very, very sad that I have to deal with that. But one has to go on and hope for a better future for the people. Okay. My other point is I work for ICADA, an international center, and it indicates here that I'm with ICADA. I'm no longer with ICADA because ICADA doesn't no longer exist in Syria. The center that had hundreds of thousands of dollars, in fact millions put into it, is destroyed. Beautiful center, one of the finest research centers in the world that I spent 20 years in. It's gone. It's occupied by the rebels. We don't hear anything about it. And one feels a total sense of failure having been there and having this incredible destruction. The center now is decentralized in Jordan and in Beirut and other places, but the actual station itself is gone. And that's very, very sad. Anyway, when I was asked to give the presentation here, I thought, what will I talk about? And I thought it's a diverse group, so I'll just give a general presentation on soil fertility for crop production in the Middle East, and basically my own experiences. So I'm going to run through it fairly quickly, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, essentially give you the flavor of the work. That's what you really need to know, and basically I'll come up with some conclusions. Now we live in a world that's ever-changing. Some of our speakers talked about that. You all know that. Economically, climatically it's changing, and in the Middle East, politically it's changing. These are the challenges. It's very common now to talk about challenges that we all face. And you look at them, there's a whole mix of them: poverty, population growth, and so on, socioeconomic constraints. These are all the things that affect agricultural production and the farmer. I come from a farming background. We had a very small farm in Ireland, so I have some feeling for people that grow up in a small place. We actually had, there were 6 of us in the family. We had no electricity and very low income, no running water. So I have a feeling for the people out there in our region of the Middle East and beyond that suffer and that are trying to make a living. The tragedy of poverty, it was alluded by some of our speakers. This is terrible, that people go to bed hungry. What's it like? Most of us don't experience that. But a lot of people, there are millions of people that are still, in this day and age, going to bed hungry, despite the fact that we have lots of food and food wasted. This is a reality. Now, as we look, another aspect of change that has been mentioned here is climate change. And from my information and from my colleagues in the Middle East, climatologists, the Middle East is going to become drier. Now, this was one of the centers of civilization. This is where agriculture began, where mankind evolved, and civilization. This is going to become drier. Things are going to get worse. I would love to say, yes, they're going to get better, but they're not. Realistically, they're not. Looking at water, we're not able to invent water. The situation in the Middle East is going to become more dire in the future. What are we going to do about it? We have to rack our brains to see, can we do anything about it? Merely doing research is not a guarantee that change will come about. There are other problems that we have in the Middle East: erosion, salinity, overgrazing. There's more sheep than people in the Middle East. And overgrazing, because you have the laws of common land, the tragedy of the commons. That's so well played out in the Middle East, and that's the reason you have so much overgrazing, and you have erosion, you have destruction. Historically, you have destruction of civilizations in the Middle East. Urbanization. All the good land is now being built on by houses, villas, factories, and all you need to do in the Middle East is fly over Egypt, for instance, and you look down, it's all lights in the nighttime. All the good land is being built upon. There's no such thing, effectively, as zoning. This is a tragedy for me. How do we change this? Now, I spent my 20 years in the Middle East, the last 20 years, with one of the CG centers. You have one here in Hyderabad, Agri, and I won't belabor these. Look at the slide here. These centers around the world are focusing on crops, and they're focusing on improving the standard of living in developing countries, poorer people. Some are focusing on crops like Syria on wheat, and we heard about the Agri on rice. Others are more on disciplines and multi-dimensional. This CG system, which has been in effect since about 1971, they have a strategy. And the strategy is very broad: to improve human health and nutrition, increase productivity and sustainable resources, and as all of these, improve policies. So you have to have a big picture in what you're doing. We have what's called a mandate. And when we were set up, ICADA was set up, they were given a region. Our region was the Middle East, and basically connecting with dry areas throughout the world. We have a very strong connection with Idrisat here, especially on pulses, legumes, chickpea, and lentils. I've never been there, but in a few days I'm actually going to go there and meet some friends. This is our original Middle East. Look at all the countries there. The ones in the yellowish are the original ones that we dealt with, and the other ones up in the Soviet Union, we inherited them, so we got involved in trying to improve agriculture after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, I mentioned water, and we look into the future. can't invent water, and as population increases, greater demand, there'll be less and less for people in the future. Sad reality. Population. In my view, this is crucial to what is happening in the Middle East today. It's fundamental to the Arab Spring. All of the countries, whether Tunisia, Yemen, had huge population. Syria had the second highest growth rate population in the world for years after Kenya. In the 60s, they had about 3 million people. Now it's about 20 million people. A lot of mouths to feed, a lot of educated people, a lot of dissatisfied people, a lot of people looking for change. So that is across the way. We look at these numbers here, it's staggering. How can that part of the world sustain this population in the future and without destroying the resources and without having revolutions? It's very difficult. Now, I'm not one to say we should restrict population. In my family, there were 6 of us, but now in the next generation, or the current generation in Ireland, 2 children. So, but that really hasn't kicked in the Middle East. But that's the job of sociologists and politicians and other people. The projected increase in population is indicated here, and total is going to double. What are the challenges in dry areas? And they are even more extreme than the global challenges in general. Poverty, conflicts, food and feed gap, because we've got to feed the animals as well. Biodiversity loss, that is happening. Human capacity development, out migration, all of these problems, the sorry bedfellows are all together in dry areas. Now, in our particular strategy, we look at, we want to alleviate the poverty of people and produce sustainable rural development. And these are the indicated here, looking at water scarcity, desertification, biodiversity loss, and improving livelihoods. Now this slide points out how important that the Middle East, this was the fertile crescent, the green arc there. This is where mankind stopped becoming a hunter and settled down, and settled agriculture began in the villages of Mesopotamia. It's a very rich cultural area. And despite all of that, it's lagging today. It's not able to feed itself. I think there's only one country in the region that is self-sufficient, that is Turkey. Countries like Jordan, they're not even 10% self-sufficient in food. So an incredible challenge, and the irony is that that's where agriculture began. That's where our crops, so cereal crops, the pulses originated. That's where the sheep came out. And here, it's a very historic area. This part of the world, you've had focal points for civilization evolving. This slide here, let me just look at that. This shows we deal with dryland agriculture. That our center, the focus was on that. And this shows that October, the rainfall increases here and then decreases. So you have 2 seasons. You have a rain-fed season and you have a dry season. And that's your window of opportunity for cropping. Historically, that's the case. But with land use pressure, this is changing very quickly. This slide shows the various agro-ecosystems in the Middle East, from the desert down where rainfall is very low, less than 100 millimeters, up to rangeland, then livestock systems with barley and wheat-based systems, and finally with the relatively high rainfall at 600, where you have a diversity of cropping. The animal in the Middle East is integrated. It's all part of the system. And that's why if you read the Bible or any of the references, the sheep is always part of the system. Now, we have a global mandate for barley, lentil, and fava bean, and for the regional one, C1, which is Central and West Asia, we have wheat with simmet, forage legumes, and chickpea with icrosal, as I mentioned before. The constraints, in my country, we have rain all the time, and it's easy to produce crops, easy to produce grass, but in the Middle East, we don't get rain, and we have drought with heat. Our breeders have a challenge to produce crops that are drought resistant and are heat tolerant. Indeed, they're cold as well. I've experienced some of the coldest days of my life in the Middle East. We're in one period where it was about -10, -12 for about 6 weeks consecutively. Incredible. And we have salinity. Salinity is where you have salt. The ancient culture in Mesopotamia was built on irrigation, but it collapsed because of the buildup of salt. This slide basically says, as our previous speaker said, we have no more land. How we produce more food, we'll only produce it from increased productivity from land that's already being cultivated. Now, this picture is the one of Syria. You've heard of Aleppo and Damascus and Homs and Hama and all of these things in the media. Aleppo, we're very fortunate actually up here that the rainfall is higher. And this side, the other side, they don't show up too well in this slide, but we were able to have stations down here in the desert, the dry area, and over here the high rainfall. So basically, our substations were proxy for the entire region. Again, that's very, very sad that what has happened. Hopefully sometime it will change. This is a look at the landscape. It's a patchwork of small farms. That in itself is a problem in terms of development of soils. They're not all dry. Some soils are rich in organic matter. I lived in Morocco for a number of years, and there were rich soils, they were shallow, but they had a lot of organic matter. Depth is important there because it dictates the water holding capacity. Low organic matter in general, because of the high temperatures, is critically important. And chemically, the soils are weakly weathered. Now, soil scientists love to show profiles, and this was one that at a site, an on-farm site in Morocco. It's a shallow soil, very productive. Our modus operandi, as it were, as scientists with ICADA, is to work with the national programs. We have to link in, we're polyvalent. And this center in Morocco was one of our major partners, and I put it in there. I was there just a couple of months ago. They helped us a lot, we helped them. A picture of one of our soils at the station. It's like a vertisol, but not quite. We have many deep soils there. Now, if we look at the past, let's say 1970, and now, the big changes. In the past, everything was kind of traditional, minimum fertilizer, kind of subsistence farming, as it were, limited machinery, and fallow land lying idle just to conserve the moisture. Now, fast forward a few decades, more irrigation, more fertilizer use. In fact, they're all using fertilizer now. And I'll show some slides on that. Virtually, fallow is disappearing. You have continuous culture there and greater cropping diversity. So that's what I've experienced since I first came there in 1977. That's the first time I came to Syria to visit. Looking at the major nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and micronutrients, well, I worked on all of those. My whole life was dealing with these. Not in great depth, but kind of across the board to look at how we could have a practical impact. This slide shows a demonstration we had in Morocco. At a time when I came there, 1988, there was no fertilizer use. So we had these on-farm demonstrations and showed, yeah, adding nitrogen, 40 kilos, 80 kilos, 120, you get something like this. And we convinced farmers that, yes, you'll have more grain and you'll have more straw for the sheep and their animals, which is vitally important. So now I go back to Morocco and I find everybody's using nitrogen fertilizer. So we got that message to them. Nitrogen research now, I'm a firm believer that we stand on the shoulders of the previous generation. And we should not reinvent the wheel. Research should be research, not research as doing the same old thing again. And you find that in many institutions, people come along and they're doing something that was done 20 or 30 years before. So if you look at nitrogen, what I did in the last few years, I figured that, well, I'm coming to an end, and I put it all together. And I did. I actually summarized all the work on nitrogen in the Middle East and it called throughout the Middle East and published it in Advances in Agronomy. So it's there. Nobody can come along in the future and say, well, we'll have to do this again. It's done. Let's move forward. And so these are the items that were done over the years. We characterized nitrogen dynamics. We looked at leaching, the losses, volatilization, all well characterized. We quantified how much nitrogen is fixed from the various legume crops, and we looked at quality. We looked at responses in relation to rainfall, and we had models to do that. We had soil testing. Nitrate was actually a good measure of the need for nitrogen. Then we looked at the nitrogen use efficiency. That's the key thing. Somebody said, our last speaker said, the efficiency is 30%, the rest is lost. We want to get more of that into the crop, get it up to 60%, 80%. That would be wonderful. Don't waste it. It's bad for the environment if we do. We looked at nitrogen in the system, not just one crop, but down the line. How you're feeding the cereal crop and the legume crop, and then some years later it's built up in the organic matter. And we did look at organic matter. This is an old slide deliberately, because that was the kind of thing that you experienced in the 1970s. Phosphorus deficiency was everywhere. Everywhere you go, you'd see it. If you put on some phosphorus, there will be a response. It's hard to find that now. Now, with phosphorus, I did my PhD in phosphorus many moons ago, and I've worked all my life on this. Still, there are things we need to know about it. But in the Middle East, we need to understand the chemistry of phosphorus. It's dominated by carbonate, and the soils are basically calcareous. And so, but what I found out there, that adding phosphorus, it builds up, the available phosphorus builds up very quickly, in contrast to what the textbooks used to tell us. So I did look at the reactions in the soil, so I think we've made a lot of progress there. I looked at more detail when I was in Lebanon for the 11 years. I had students like Prasad. We worked in the lab and we did line wear isotherms and all of this to kind of quantify the chemical behavior of phosphorus. That's all now part of the system. We looked at various crops and how they would respond, cereals and legumes, which had more need for phosphorus. And there was something on mycorrhiza. For a long time, I was a one-man show. In fact, I didn't have many colleagues at all, and few students, and it was difficult, so you couldn't go too deep, but you had to kind of branch out and interact with agronomists and plant breeders and people like that. Fortunately, the potassium, calcium, magnesium are fairly well supplied. Calcium, magnesium, plenty, the calcareous soils. Potassium, I've done a few studies on that and show the soils are not highly weathered, so there's a high reserve of available potassium. And that is reflected in actual farmer use. The general perception is that there is plenty of potassium. And I'm not saying that in the future that it's going to be. As you take more from the soil, you got to put something back in. And I have some friends and they get into a panic when I say this, and I say, yeah, sure, with more irrigation crops like sugar beets and potatoes, you would have to put potassium. Now this slide, compound slide, shows fertilizer use in the region. Now that is common. In all of the countries since 1970, you had nitrogen took off. Now, ICARDA wasn't responsible for that. Maybe it would happen anyway. So you increase nitrogen use, and then it kind of levels out. And that's natural. The same with phosphorus. It levels out. There are factors concerned in that. Like in Syria, the phosphate factory was damaged and there was no production. But we are now at a plateau where crops are fairly well fertilized. See the little one at the bottom, the potassium, this is very low. So there's no possibility. It's not a big deal, potassium. And we come to micronutrients. When I went there first, nobody talked about micronutrients. They said nitrogen and phosphorus are big things, forget about micronutrients. But gradually, as we eliminated the nitrogen and phosphorus as factors, other micronutrients came out. I did some work with Professor Berger way back when I was in Lebanon on boron and zinc. And gradually, we realized that there are problems with micronutrients, and especially with zinc. There was a major project in Turkey, and this was funded by the EU. Many papers were produced by it, and what they showed, that whole areas, cereal yields were limited by zinc. And the man who worked on that, Professor Chakmak, he had an ingenious way of solving the problem. He just added a few kilos of zinc oxide or zinc sulfate to the compound fertilizer. And it had a huge effect. He calculated that it was worth about $100 million to the Turkish economy. A simple solution to a problem that people didn't realize was there. And again, if you look at the chemistry of the soil, low organic matter and the calcium carbonate, that dictates the low zinc. Iron, it was referred to, plenty of iron in the soil, but it's not available. Some crops can't take it up. And human beings that eat those crops are deficient, especially women and children. There's high incidence in human nutrition of iron deficiency. And I believe that zinc deficiency in some places as well. Okay, I'll come back to that in a moment. And we found boron. Some of you may have worked on boron. It's we think it's deficient in the soil. But what we found is that there are some pockets in the region that have too much boron. And the difference between too little boron and too much is only 1 or 2 parts per million. And because the area had been an inland sea, and some areas have high boron, and you can do nothing about it. The only solution to the boron, I think I have a few slides on that now, is breeding. Get breeders to get varieties that are tolerant to that higher level of boron. This was an old slide that's been reproduced many times in Konya and Turkey. In the foreground, no zinc, in the background, zinc. It was incredible crop response from adding zinc. Did a little greenhouse experiment on zinc and phosphorus and interaction. It was published in Agronomy Journal. And look here to the right, you have nothing, just a few miserable little plants. Then you have phosphorus, very little, but phosphorus and zinc and the whole shebang there, you have very good yield. So talking about zinc, while I was when I was doing that, was one of my activities. I got talking to people from Ethiopia, Bangladesh, and places like that, and they said this zinc might be implicated in a human problem of human nutrition. That grass pea is common in Ethiopia. It has a toxin, and it causes this crippling of the limbs. And I looked into the literature and I found that actually zinc had something to do with it. We don't know why, but we bred some lines, and I added zinc to the various lines, and I found that the level of toxin was reduced. It's not the solution. The solution is working with the breeders to get rid of this toxin. In the last 20 years or so, we got involved with micronutrients at the global level and within the CED system. Now, the approach is, let's work with the plant. Let's kind of get the plant to take up zinc more efficiently or iron more efficiently. Instead of adding something to the soil or adding some nutrient to the food, you get the soil to be more efficient at delivering it. Now, the boron, I'm back here, this slide is a little bit out of place, but it highlights the significance of that. I had a colleague with me in Uganda. He worked on breeding, and he found that many land races were tolerant to boron. So he's gone now. I wish that there was a continuation of that breeding program, that the breeders would think, okay, we can try and incorporate this trait into the new higher yielding variety, as with all of the other things that you incorporate. Sustainability was a buzzword years ago. and in the 90s. I remember everybody was talking about it. What does it mean? In my view, just if we can keep producing and not destroy the base. This was an example I put in this slide in the 90s. Last 10 years, the situation changed very completely in the Middle East. Before, people would never burn anything. The straw was a resource. The animals would eat it. Now, they burn the straw because they want to irrigate it for the summer and plant another crop. It shows the change in intensification. We did have a long-term trial. We had several of them, but this is a picture from one, a major one. I published several papers on this. In fact, I have a review on rotation trials in the Middle East. And this yielded wonderful information because we quantified the amount of organic matter that can build up over the years. We quantified how growing a crop in sequence with a legume can increase the organic matter, increase the nitrogen. So here on your right-hand side, there was no nitrogen added to that. There was just a previous legume. So it was very wonderful information. Unfortunately, our administrators didn't think that this should be funded, and it was cancelled. It's a pity, because there are no trials like this. In the United States, they have trials that go on for 100 years in Illinois and Missouri. In Rothamsted, in England, they have a trial that's going on since 1840-something. Okay, now, as a plant nutritionist, I was involved with irrigation as well. This is an old slide on surface irrigation, sprinkler irrigation, and water catchment. So it's quite different when you're dealing with fertilization, dry land, and you consider the water factor. Here, I won't belabor that, but we did look at the responses of various crops and how they differed genetically. This slide shows something new, and we're talking about wastewater. This is some pumps on the Quantum River going through Aleppo. Wastewater is the only growing source of water in the Middle East. The only growing source. There's a lot of water from the big cities. And I think there was a kind of Islamic injunction against using wastewater, but now things are changing. We have to purify it and use it in agriculture in many cities in the world. They're recycling, we're drinking water that has been recycled. So I did a study, a very brief study. I went down and I sampled this, and I asked people, are you using fertilizer? They said, yes, but we have the water. And I checked, full of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. And I said, you don't need, the water it provides the water and it provides nutrients at the same time. Part of my work in Syria was I was in charge of the lab. I interacted with all of the labs around the region, and these are some of my colleagues. The lab is destroyed now. The staff are dispersed and they're without jobs. It's sad. We did have a network throughout the Middle East in many countries. We met in various places, and we had field trials, lab trials, tested various methods of analysis, and I think we made a great deal of progress. We had established a basis for applying fertilizer, so it's there. Now, the change that I alluded to, conservation agriculture is coming in. Before we had deep tillage and all of that, excessive tillage, getting rid of carbon to the atmosphere. Now we're getting into minimum till, and that requires a change in the thinking for fertilization. Now, we're coming to where we are right now. We have to kind of look back in the system and say, can we consolidate the knowledge we have and move forward? We have to build on the past, crop cultivars suited to different agroecologies, partnerships. We have to build on all of this, improve farming systems and decision support systems. We have to think of these the more sophisticated way of doing things. Tools for linking human and ecological systems, and policy. Everything, nothing can take place in a vacuum, as finished up. That's the whole point. You must have a structural system to support the farmer. legislative system, regulatory, protect the water. Then in any agricultural research, you've got to sell the idea to donors, because you can't work if you don't get money. And governments don't have much money for agricultural research. You must support technology development. We're continuously moving forward. And human resource development, I was involved in that too, training people. I'm a great believer in training people. In the project in Morocco, we trained about 50 people in the United States with a PhD degree. Some resigned and went on, but most of them are in Morocco and contributing as scientists. It's not people like me who come from outside who do this, it's the people themselves, human resources. Now, my conclusions, future crop production in Mediterranean agriculture will depend on chemical fertilizers, irrigation water and improved varieties. I personally have little tolerance for people who have the idea that we should go back to the Stone Age and go organic. I believe in organic, whatever waste material, organic, use it, but you're not going to feed people on that. We must use the knowledge that we already have. So many people don't think about what is already there and move forward on it. The extent to which the Middle East region can fully exploit its agricultural potential depends on enabling government policies. I can't emphasize that strongly enough. The government must protect and create an environment for the farmer to do his bit to increase production and get food security and all of that. Now, I leave you with the hope that we're looking at these lovely young people. I hope that there is a future for Syrian people like that, and that there will be an end to this nightmare of a war that's going on. Senseless war where people are destroyed, because agriculture is destroyed, the agricultural base, in a civil war as well. So let's hope, and I'm sure you'll join with me in hoping that very soon there will be an end to this, and somehow our work as agricultural scientists will be able to contribute to mankind, and we'll leave our lives saying, we made an impact on this world. We made life better for people. Shukran kathir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan, for such an educative and informative presentation. May I now request Dr. Gedela to felicitate Dr. Ryan with a shawl.
My wife will take it to me when I get back.
Sir.